What happens when God gives you victory, but you still refuse to fully obey Him? When grace is shown again and again and still ignored? Dear friends, welcome to Under the Word, where we daily read and wrestle with the scriptures, not merely for information, but for formation. Right now, we're going to reflect on First Kings chapter 20 through 22, and then Psalm 100. See, we continue in the books of the Kings. We are now coming to an end of chapter 1, which is also nearing the end of King Ahab's reign. See, these chapters bring the northern kingdom's corruption into a sharp focus. In fact, the commentary that I have been referencing throughout this study, housed from the New American Commentary and then Provan from Understanding the Bible Commentary, they tell us that these ending chapters in First King emphasize Ahab is not simply evil, but he is persistently resistant to God despite repeated opportunities to respond. The issue is no longer ignorance, it is actually blatant refusal, the hardening of the heart, which is familiar to us through Pharaoh, right? So let's jump in. So First Kings chapter 20, right? So Ahab here faces a powerful king, Ben-Hadad of Aram, right? So God delivers Israel not because of Ahab's righteousness, but for his own name, right? So if you remember reading this, God says, "You shall know that I am Yahweh." In other words, I am the Lord. You see, this is a reoccurring theme, right? So God reveals himself even to a corrupt king, right? So but the beauty of it is because of his holy name, right? Israel wins decisively, but Ahab makes a critical mistake, a critical error again, right? He spares Ben Hadad and forms an alliance. A prophet confronts him. In fact, he goes on to say, "Because you have let go of let go out of your own hand the man whom I had devoted to destruction," the prophet says. See, dear friends, this echoes a Hebrew concept here, something set apart for judgment. See, God has put Ben for judgment, but Ahab makes an allegiance with him. In fact, here, the New American Commentary House notes this, that Ahab repeats Saul's failure in 1 Samuel chapter 15. What does Saul do, if you remember? Partial obedience, which is actually really disobedience. And then in this chapter, then we see that God pronouncing judgment. And then in chapter 21, this chapter exposes the depth of Ahab's morals corruption. Ahab desires Naboth's vineyard. He had plenty of yards, yet he longs for this one man. When this man refuses, based on a covenant law protecting inheritance, Ahab is unhappy, and his wife Jezebel takes control. She orchestrates false accusations leading to this man's execution. My goodness, this is what theologians call a judicial murder. In fact, proven from biblical commentary. He emphasizes that this is not just it's not just a personal sin. It is a systemic abuse of power, overturning God's law for personal gain. Elijah confronts Ahab. "Have you killed and also taken possession?" he says. See, judgment right here is declared. Ahab's house will fall and fall terribly. That Jezebel will be judged strictly. Yet Ahab's response with humility or temporarily, something that we haven't seen to this point. And it also shows you just how abundantly merciful God is, right? So because God delays judgment because he sees Ahab's temporary remorse. See, this reveals, I really believe, two things to us. One is that the seriousness of sin, and the second thing is that the reality of God's mercy. So imagine this man that has just been so destructive, disobedient. When God looked at the brokenness of his heart, his remorse, and even that moment, God is willing to show mercy. What an amazing God that we serve. And then we move to the last chapter of First Kings, right? So where Ahab seeks to rebuke Ramoth Gilead. So this is 400 prophets of firm success. 400. But Jehoshaphat, if you remember, asked for a true prophet. It says Micaiah is, and then another prophet is called Micaiah, right? He speaks the truth. First, he wanted to just go with them, and then finally the king says, like, nope, tell me the truth. And he speaks the truth, saying, I saw all Israel scattered. He reveals a vision where Ahab is destined to fall. Ahab rejects the word and imprisons this prophet. Says, like, when I return, and the prophet says, if you return, then I have really misspoken. He proceeds anyway, and then just as the prophet spoke, he's killed in a battle. See, a straight hero fulfills the prophecy. In fact, here, the New American House in the New American Commentary notes that this chapter demonstrates that God's word cannot be avoided, only ignored at a great cost. See, the chapter ends with transitions in both Israel and Judah. And then Psalm 100 provides a striking contrast. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. See, dear friends, this psalm calls for universal worship. Know that the Lord, he is God. See, this is what Ahab refused to acknowledge. The commentary that we have been following along for the book of Psalm by Golden Gate, from the Baker commentary on the Old Testament wisdom and Psalms. He explains that Psalm 100 emphasizes three things: the God as creator, God as shepherd, and God as faithful. The psalmist says his steadfast love endures forever. See, dear friends, this is an invitation Ahab repeatedly ignored. If honest, I repeatedly ignore. May God help us all. And so the readings, these chapters from the readings then present a sobering contrast. You see, in our last few chapters in the book of Kings, we see four things, right? So God gives victory, that God sends prophets, that God offers opportunities, and we see that Ahab repeatedly refuses. And then I'll read them from Psalm. We see that God calls for joyful worship, that God reveals his goodness, and that God invites his people to know him intimately. And so the unifying truth in all of this, I believe, is this: that God's grace is real, but it must be received through obedience and trust, my dear friends. You see, Ahab experiences God's power, but rejects his authority, which leads then to judgment. But I believe all of this points forward to Christ, the King who perfectly obeys and invites all to true worship. Where Jesus says, the Father seeks true worshipers who will worship in spirit and truth. So today's readings, friends, confronts us directly in many ways, especially in these four ways. First, It exposes selective obedience. And we've been talking about this, so this is a repeated theme. See, Ahab obeys when convenient, but not completely. But God calls us to obedience at all times. And second, it warns against abusing power. See, Naboth's story reveals how sin corrupts systems, what Jezebel did to conspire to kill an innocent man. See, third, it challenges our response to truth. Do we listen or dismiss what we do not like? Had Ahab listened, his life would have been preserved because he rejected the voice of truth because it didn't align with him. The consequence was dire, death in the battlefield. And then fourth, it calls us to true worship. See, Psalm 100 reminds us who God is and what he deserves: a full, wholehearted devotion and worship and adoration. My dear friends, I beg of us, let us not ignore God's voice. Let us not delay obedience. Let us not assume that repeated grace means unlimited opportunities. The truth is, we must respond now, for tomorrow is not guaranteed. We must listen carefully. We must obey fully and worship God, not just in words, but in our lives, through our actions, and with our very breath. Because the God who calls you is worthy of it. He is so good, so faithful, and so worthy, dear friends. So as always, I want to encourage us. Let's continue to be faithful in returning to the word over and over. Not just return, but let us remain attentive. Let us stay obedient. And as always, let us stay under the word. And again, thank you for watching this video and spending part of your day with me. If this video has been helpful, I encourage you to share it with friends. If you are not following us, I encourage you to follow our church YouTube channel. Subscribe, hit the subscribe button and follow us. God bless you, and I'll see you in the next reflection.